Hello everyone, welcome back to White Change channel. This is Yulia. Let's continue our conversation about what do you do as a business analyst in a new organization or on a new project. You may have already watched my previous videos, day 1 as a business analyst, where we summarized how you get to know the company, research about the project, collect information, try to understand some background of your project, meet with the team, discover templates and existing knowledge base. Day 2 video, I talked more about how do you get more familiar with that new project you get assigned to. So collecting materials from feasibility study, discussing what is the goal of the project, trying to understand its objectives and the scope, as well as leading or planning those first discovery meetings. And in day 3, we talked about how to plan job shadowing or immersion in a business process, which is a really excellent way for you to get that discovery going, to understand the current process with which you will be working on this project, or potentially improving it, optimizing it, or automating it. Now let's talk about the next step in the series. What do you do as a business analyst? Let's talk today about how do you use the job shadowing or immersion activity to help you discover more about the scope of the project, to help you discover additional stakeholders, and to better understand what is that scope of functionality that you need to analyze, understand, and capture requirements for. So imagine that you are with your subject matter expert. You are having that day of job shadowing that you planned well. And again, if you want to go back to how to plan it, go to the day 3 video. Now you are sitting together, or maybe you're doing this through a video conference, and your subject matter expert explains to you how they do their daily job, what is this process about, what are the different steps, what are the purposes of each step, and demonstrate to you how this is done. You are observing, you're asking questions, you're trying to understand it. So let's focus on what are the various goals that you're trying to achieve as you go through that exercise. Okay, so first of all, of course, your main goal is to understand current business process, how this is done. It could be sorting packages. It could be reviewing and responding to complaints. It could be onboarding new vendors and suppliers and setting them up in the system. Whatever that process is, the process will have a starting point, it will have specific steps, and you need to understand the logic for going from one step to another. You need to understand when the process diverges and what's behind it. So as you're going through all of that, what are the other things that you will and should discover as you go? For example, as you discover those process steps, and certain steps may lead to one of multiple options depending on a certain factor and condition, you need to really understand those conditions. For example, which complaints need to be escalated and which complaints may be refused, and which complaints need to be handled first and given highest priority. There will be certain rules around it. So one of the important things you're going to do is to ask about those rules. We call them business rules. If you're talking to a person from operations, you can use whatever terms are familiar to them. You can say, what are the rules behind it? Or do you follow any procedures? Or how do you know which way? And they may have a little, job description where these rules are written down. They may have a special policy that they have to consult. They may have a sticky note where there are instructions written, or they may just have that in your head. But there usually is a source for those rules in organization, right? So if there is a certain rule of how a complaint or a new vendor onboarding file needs to be handled, it could be related to an accounting policy. It could be related to some legal instructions. It could be business policy, right, based on which vendors your company prefers to work with, or what are service levels that your company is obligated to conform to for processing complaints. So ask about business rules, ask about the source of where the rules come from, and what are those official documents perhaps in your company that you need to understand. If it's a policy, get a copy of a policy memo or get a link to where this is stored. And with that link, you'll probably get a name of the stakeholder responsible for that policy, and that may be a stakeholder that you will need to ask questions later or connect with. If this is a business policy, it may be published by a certain department, and maybe you need to know who is behind that policy, who owns it. For example, a director of vendor onboarding or vice president of procurement. Again, you'll need their name because they might be a stakeholder that eventually will have to approve things, or that will provide more background if you need it. Okay, so that's the rules. The rules are really important. Now, the rules usually live longer than a specific system or workaround or a tool, right? Because rules are inherent to how that organization runs its business. Sometimes rules are even driven by regulatory requirements. So something that is above the company. Maybe there is a regulatory requirement like related to accounting or related to, managing of insurance companies or companies' liability, and that rule can be driven by a regulatory body, and say all of the companies in this industry have to comply with it. So once you focus on those rules, you'll discover that you have more sources of information and you have more artifacts that will be useful to your analysis and that are necessary for your future requirements, because the rules need to be followed. If the rule needs to be changed, or if the rule has to be for some reason deviated from, that needs to be analyzed, documented, and approved to avoid any issues later. Next, the second thing that you need to watch out for when you're doing the job shadowing or you're doing the immersion in an operations process is watching out for different scenarios. Scenario means that for a similar situation, depending on various factors, the processing may vary a little bit or significantly, right? So you can have one scenario for a complaint that originates from a new customer versus a very important customer, right? That you really need to make sure you keep happy. There may be different scenarios whether you're handling a complaint from a person versus a corporate customer that maybe has a really big account and multiple users may be impacted. The scenario may differ based on whether it's the first complaint or repeating complaint. It may differ based on whether it's a known issue for which you already have a solution, or it's a new solution which needs to be investigated because you actually don't know how to help the customer yet. So all of these will be different variations, say, of how to process complaints. If you're involved in vendor onboarding, your scenarios may be related again to the size of the vendor, how urgently you need this vendor. Have you reached out to them, or is this the vendor trying to sell you their services? Whether this vendor has all of the necessary documentation, or whether you need to go back and forth and confirm whether they're compliant, for example, with any regulations, or do they have appropriate insurance, and so on. So with scenarios, to discover those, you may ask questions like, is that always this way? What types of vendors you might be seeing? Or at this point, what are the different complaints that you need to process slightly differently? What happens if this? What happens if that? What are the variance in sizes? What are the different categories of things or events you have to deal with? So various questions of this nature will help you discover variations in the process. Again, that is super important. First of all, without understanding variations, you may not be able to capture the overall process flow. You may be missing requirements. Secondly, variations often lead you to discover exceptions or alternate scenarios where things need to be done differently in case something special happens. It may not happen very often, but when it does, different processing is required. So again, when we miss those, we may end up with gaps later. The other reason we want to discover some scenarios, it gives us an idea of which factors influence the decisions, so influence how the flow will diverge. And based on that, you can also later do more data analysis. Because think about it, when you talk to your subject matter expert about scenarios, they may give you quite a few examples, they may list things. Probably they are not there to give you an explicit list of every single scenario, right? First of all, they may not deal with all of them. Secondly, it's just hard for human beings to think that way and remember every single factor. But once you discover those factors, after your job immersion, you can go back and you can do some data analysis. If you are comfortable with running queries and you have access, say, to a data warehouse, you can even run some queries yourself. By the way, I have a video about why business analysts should not be afraid of SQL. Check that video out. You're being able to run queries and do some data analysis, even if it's very simple, is priceless, and it gives you huge advantages as a business analyst. Now, if you can't, or you don't have access, or for any other reason you need help, get help. You probably have a development team, or you have analytics team, or you have someone in reporting team, a reporting analyst, or a data analyst that you can approach and get help. And maybe they're even one of your project team members, right, that can help you with data analysis, which will help you validate what other scenarios are possible. Okay, so remember, we covered business rules, we talked about scenarios. What else? The other thing is user experience. Your subject matter expert, as they're showing you how they do things today, they may be using an existing system or existing 3 or 4 or 5 different systems. It really depends on your landscape of applications. So watch for user experience and where their process is easy and clear, because the applications and systems and tools they are using provide them with good experience. Good experience means it's clear for me what to do. I can easily find the information I need. The information is displayed to me in a logical manner. I'm not confused by menus. I know where to go. I don't need to log out and log in into another system. I don't need to copy and paste things or download and upload them. So various times where you need to do a swivel chair from one system to another, or you need to write things down and then put them into another system, or you need to download the data because systems are not integrated. All of those things are something you can note during your job immersion, because they may be really the detracting factor, something that makes user experience not as great. Now, whether your project aims to change that user experience or not is a different story. Maybe it didn't, but it might be included in scope because you notice these things as you go. Maybe it's not something to be fixed now, but it can be captured as a future requirement. Whatever it is, always observe user experience, because remember, any software that gets developed to be used by business people, any type of system application, business application, has a much higher chance of success, of course, if it's easy to use and it's convenient and a little bit more intuitive, right? So pay attention to that. You can always take screenshots. With our new ability to use video conferencing and recording, we are so much better at it these days. We have a lot of tools. Make quick recordings, record screen sequences, or take a lot of screenshots if you are doing your job shadowing virtually, and capture that, because it might actually be part of your future solution to change screen flow, to improve user experience, to change the design of screens and layouts, or displaying additional data to make the user's life easier. Okay, so that's user experience. Anything else? Think about data. Whenever you lead that project, maybe your focus is on process improvements, or optimizing the process, or automating it, or even your focus is more on reporting. Always there is, at some point, you need to capture data requirements. They could be requirements for entering the data, validating data, extracting data from one system to be used in another system, or using data to produce reports and analytics. So pay attention to data. If you don't understand the term mentioned by the business expert, ask them what it means. Ask them, is it written down somewhere? Do you have a glossary? Is there a list of frequently used terms? Check whether there is a data dictionary. Of course, if you're preparing for job shadowing, you can also see in advance if you can get some information from the previous project, from data architect, from enterprise architect, from your knowledge base. Try to be prepared to understand the terms or catch up with the terms quickly. But if you don't have any resources in front of you, or if you didn't have time to do this background search, ask your expert about the meaning and where it's captured and whether you can capture it so that you're more familiar with data. Now, if you see some data fields on screens that are being used as part of the process, again, make sure you understand what they mean. What is the data type? What are the various values? How the value of each of those fields or factors influences the business process, and capture that. And chances are that some of that is going to change as part of the project. So watch out for data, for fields, for attributes that are important to what you're analyzing. Number 5 is exceptions. Every process will have exceptions where things don't go right, when things break down, where something is late, where customer is not responding, where important information is missing, etc., etc., etc. Ask about exceptions. What if customer didn't pay the full amount? What if the package gets lost? What if this vendor actually doesn't have valid insurance, or the insurance is expired? So whenever the expert explains to you the rules of how things are done, ask them what happens if those rules are not followed or broken, because capturing exceptions is part of business analysis. And oftentimes, that's again where the gaps in functionality happen if the system doesn't handle exceptions. And you may even know the term exception handling. So you need to think of exception handling, and to be able to capture those requirements, you first need to discover what are potential exceptions and what are the existing rules for handling them. And going back to business rules, where we started today's video, there will be, or there should be, rules for handling exceptions. If they aren't, or if you couldn't find them, definitely you need to dig more. Okay. Another piece of information you want to watch for when you're doing job shadowing is understanding the impacts on other departments, or what happens downstream from this process you're observing now. So every process has a trigger, like starting point and then an end point where the process is completed. But after that, there may be another process, or there may be something else happening. Is there another department that takes over? For example, once the vendor is onboarded, and what information they need, and how do you let them know that you're done? So think about handoffs, notifications, providing information, and understand who downstream of this process is impacted, or who is interested in the results. Because again, if you're changing something about this current process, you need to understand how this will change, how information is passed down to the department downstream, to the reports that are being done, to the accounting department that needs to do journal entries, etc., etc., etc. And finally, remember that we also have to follow the money. So various business processes often impact the accounting side of things. So if you receive payments, if you receive new orders, if the product gets returned because it was of unacceptable quality, if customer asks for cancellation, there's many scenarios, especially exceptions, that will also impact financial side of things. So make sure you understand how that information is captured that will be needed for accounting side of business. And of course, if you don't know, you ask and you discover and you try to find out more. Now, finally, to wrap up our video about job immersion or job shadowing, let's talk about the person that you're working with today, that human being, that business expert that gave you their time to do the walkthrough of the process and explain all of that to you. So first of all, remember, you need their knowledge. You have to appreciate the time they gave to you, because you probably slowed them down and maybe they weren't able to accomplish everything they usually accomplish in a day. So be appreciative of their time. Make sure you thank them and express the same gratitude to their managers for allowing you to use their time. Think about that expert, that knowledge that will be useful to you as a business analyst, and most likely you want to foster that relationship with them going forward, because you may have to ask them questions later, right? You probably didn't ask everything in one day because you may be overwhelmed with information. This process may have been very unfamiliar to you. So make sure you part on good terms. You ask them whether you can ask questions later, whether they prefer to answer questions via email or a quick call. Make sure you retain that connection, right? Maybe you need to come back for another day. The other thing, think about it, is that person, someone who could be even a bigger part of your project. Maybe if you didn't get to discuss who is going to be supporting user acceptance testing, if you feel that this person is a good fit, that they understand how systems run, they're interested, right? They explain to you some important things, that could be a really good resource for user acceptance testing, to become a solution champion in the future and maybe even help their teammates eventually when that new solution is released to answer their questions. So make sure you build and foster those relationships with those business stakeholders and users. And remember, sometimes these people that you're doing job shadowing with know much more about the process than their managers, because managers may be too far away. They deal more with documents than with the real customers. They may know all those intricate details. So people who actually do the job every day are a huge resource to you and very important. So definitely use this time to establish relationship, to be able to come back, and whenever they give you extra information, capture it, because it may give you some new avenues of analysis that you will find really helpful. And things like that, and practicing doing this immersion and feeling more comfortable and extracting as much as possible. And that's really analyzing, right? You are doing analysis because through that demonstration you extract important things, you compare information from multiple sources, you notice discrepancies, you notice something that needs more investigation. This is how you actually do analysis. So we're wrapping up for today. This was our day 4 as a business analyst. Stay tuned until the next video and let me know if you have specific questions.